She learned the shape of her world before she knew her own name. A concrete floor, a locked door, a voice that never came. This is the true story of a girl raised in a basement and the family who decided she belonged there. Before she turned 4, she already knew nobody was coming. Hello and welcome. I'm Max, and this is Eridanus Light. Imagine a child who learns the shape of her world before she learns the sound of her own name. Before she knows what a window is, or a sky, or a birthday candle, she knows the walls. Damp concrete, a single bulb that never quite reaches the corners, the smell of old carpet, and something else. Something metallic, like rust or like fear. This is where Sarah Cody's story begins, not in a hospital room, not in a nursery with mobiles and soft blankets, but in a basement. And here's the thing, she didn't know it was wrong. Not at first. How could she? Now, Sarah was born in the early 1990s into a house that sat quiet on a suburban street in a small American town. From the outside, it looked like any other home. A porch, a lawn, a mailbox. But inside, there was a door that led down. And that door for Sarah was the border of her entire universe. Her caregivers, the people who were supposed to protect her, had decided for reasons that would only slowly surface that the basement was where she belonged. And so, from the age of 3 or 4, that's where she stayed. Think about that for a moment. A toddler learning to walk on a concrete floor, learning to talk to herself because no one else is there to answer. The first word she ever spoke might have been a name, but whose? There was no one to hear it. The first time she cried and no one came. That becomes a lesson, a terrible silent lesson. You learn that your voice doesn't matter, that your needs don't summon comfort, and so you stop crying, you stop calling out, you just exist. And yet, the human mind is remarkable. It adapts, it finds patterns. Sarah learned the sounds of the house above her, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of a television. Those sounds became her clock, her calendar, her only connection to the world she could not see. Footsteps meant someone was coming. The jingle of keys meant the door was about to open. And when that door opened, light would spill down the stairs like a flood, and she would blink and she would wait for food, for water, for the brief, silent presence of the people who kept her there. Now, here's the thing about isolation. It doesn't just affect your body, it shapes your mind. Sarah had no mirror. She had no concept of her own face. She knew her hands, her feet, the scrape of her knees against the floor, but she didn't know she was a girl, or a child, or a human being in the way you and I understand it. She was just the one who lived in the basement, and that became her identity. The room itself was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. A mattress on the floor, a bucket for a toilet, a few old blankets that smelled of mildew. There was no window, just those concrete walls, and a single light bulb controlled by a switch at the top of the stairs. That switch was her God. When it was on, she could see. When it was off, she was swallowed by darkness so complete that she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. She learned to sleep in that darkness. She learned to listen. She learned to wait. Honestly, the most chilling part is not the cruelty itself, it's the normalization, the way a child can accept the unacceptable. Sarah didn't know that other children had bedrooms with posters on the wall, or that they went to school, or that they played in the sun. She didn't know what a park was. She didn't know what a friend was. The basement was her entire reference point. And the people who came down those stairs, they weren't monsters in her eyes. They were just the people. The ones who brought food. The ones who sometimes spoke, though their words were short and flat. The ones who kept her alive, and that was enough. It had to be, and yet there were moments, flickers, something inside her that knew this wasn't right. Maybe it was the way her body ached from lying still too long, or the way hunger gnawed at her in a constant low hum, or the way she heard, through the floor, the sound of laughter. Real laughter, bright and unguarded, and felt something twist in her chest. She didn't have a word for envy. She didn't have a word for loneliness. But she felt them. Oh, she felt them. As the years passed, Sarah's world shrank further. The visits became less frequent. The food became less regular. And the darkness became a companion. She would trace patterns on the wall with her finger, memorizing every crack, every imperfection. She would talk to herself in a voice that grew hoarse from disuse. She would dream, and those dreams were the only escape she had. Dreams of light, dreams of movement, dreams of a voice that called her by name. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. She never screamed, not after the first few times, because screaming, she learned, only made the silence worse. It echoed. It reminded her that no one was coming, and so she stopped. She became quiet. She became still. She became the ghost of the house above her, unseen, unheard, unknown. Now, you might wonder, how does a child survive this? How does the mind not simply shatter? The answer is, it adapts. It builds a world inside itself. Sarah created a map of her basement that was more vivid than any atlas. She knew which corner stayed driest when it rained. She knew the exact number of steps from the mattress to the bucket 7. She knew the sound of the furnace kicking on and the way the pipes would groan in winter. She built a universe out of a few square feet, and she lived inside it. And all the while, above her, the world kept turning. The mail was delivered, the grass was mowed, neighbors waved to one another. No one knew, no one asked. The house with the basement, it was just a house. And Sarah was just a secret buried beneath the floorboards. But secrets, they have a way of pressing upward. They seep through cracks, they whisper in the dark, and Sarah, even in her isolation, began to sense something, a shift, a change in the air. The footsteps above her grew quicker, more frantic. The voices grew sharper. Something was happening in the world she couldn't see. Something that would eventually reach all the way down to her. And when it did, the door would open. Not just the physical door, but a door in her mind, a door she had kept locked for so long that she had forgotten it was there. A door to a life she had never known, a world she had never touched, a self she had never met. But that is still to come. For now, Sarah remains in the basement. The light bulb flickers. The walls breathe their damp breath. And a girl who has never seen her own reflection waits, as she has always waited, for what comes next. But let's step back for a moment and really understand what kind of world that was. Not the world above, the one with mail and grass and waving neighbors, but the world below, the world Sarah lived in day after day, year after year. Now, when we say basement, you might picture a finished rec room, maybe some old furniture, a washer and dryer, a few boxes of Christmas decorations. But that's not this. This was a basement carved out of concrete and neglect damp, unfinished, with walls that sweated moisture in the summer and radiated cold in the winter. The floor was bare concrete, rough and stained, and it sucked the warmth right out of you if you stood on it too long. And Sarah, she didn't have shoes. She didn't have socks. Her feet knew every crack, every cold spot, every rough patch of that floor. The light, well, there was one bulb, a single bare bulb dangling from a frayed wire in the center of the ceiling. It gave off a weak, yellowish glow, just enough to see shapes, just enough to cast shadows that seemed to move on their own. And here's the thing about that bulb. It wasn't always on. Her captor controlled it from upstairs. He could plunge her into absolute darkness with the flip of a switch. And he did. Often. For hours. Sometimes for days. Imagine that, sitting in a darkness so complete that you can't see your own hand in front of your face. A darkness that presses against your eyes, that makes you wonder if you've gone blind, that erases the line between waking and dreaming, and the silence. Ah, the silence. You'd think silence would be peaceful, wouldn't you? But not this silence. This was a heavy, living silence, the kind that fills your ears with a ringing hum that makes you strain for any sound, any proof that you're not alone in the universe. Sarah learned to listen. She learned to hear the house above her, the creak of floorboards, the groan of pipes, the distant murmur of a television. She learned to tell time by the sounds, the morning footsteps, the afternoon clatter of dishes, the evening click of a lock. These sounds became her calendar, her clock, her only connection to a world that had forgotten her. And food, well, let's talk about that. Food came irregularly, unpredictably, sometimes twice a day, sometimes once, sometimes not at all. A tray would appear at the bottom of the stairs. Cold food, usually. Sandwiches that had gone soggy. Cereal with milk that had turned. Canned soup, eaten cold because there was no way to heat it, and water, always a plastic cup of tap water, lukewarm and tasting faintly of copper. Sarah learned to make it last. She learned to ration, to stretch a single meal across 2 days, to ignore the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Because here's the thing about hunger. It doesn't just hurt your belly, it hollows you out, it makes you weak, dizzy, confused. It makes it harder to think, harder to remember who you are, harder to hold on to hope. And the bucket, yes, there was a bucket for everything, in the corner, behind a thin curtain that didn't really hide anything. She had to empty it herself, carry it up the stairs, through the door, to a bathroom, but only when she was allowed. And permission wasn't always given. Sometimes she'd have to wait and wait and wait until the bucket overflowed, and the smell, honestly, that smell became part of the basement. It seeped into the concrete, into the walls, into her clothes. It was the smell of her own captivity. But here's what's really remarkable. Here's the part that still makes me pause. Sarah didn't break, not in the way you'd expect. She bent, yes. She curled inward, wrapped herself around her own mind like a small animal in a burrow. But she didn't shatter. And that survival instinct, that stubborn spark, it's something we still don't fully understand. How does a child, isolated, starved, kept in darkness, hold on to herself? How does she keep the flame of her own identity alive when everything around her is trying to snuff it out? Well, she built a world inside her head. She memorized every crack in the ceiling, every knot in the wooden beam above her, and gave them names. She told herself stories, long, elaborate tales about the people who might live in those cracks, about the adventures they might have, about the day they would finally escape. She sang to herself, quietly, under her breath songs she barely remembered, melodies that floated up from some deep well of childhood. She talked to the spiders that spun their webs in the corners, because they were company, and company was precious. And she learned to hate the light, not the light itself, but what it meant. Because when that bulb flickered on, it meant he was coming. It meant the door would open, and footsteps would descend, and she would have to be ready, ready to be small, ready to be silent, ready to answer questions she didn't understand. The darkness, as terrible as it was safer. In the darkness, she was invisible. In the darkness, she could pretend she didn't exist at all. Now you might wonder, how did he control her? How did a grown man keep a child compliant for so long? It wasn't chains. It wasn't ropes. It was something far more insidious. It was the slow, steady erosion of her will. He used deprivation of food, of light, of human contact to make her dependent on him. He was the one who brought the tray. He was the one who turned on the light. He was the only voice she heard, the only face she saw, the only proof that there was anything beyond those 4 concrete walls. And in that crucible of isolation, a strange, terrible bond formed, not love, not affection, but a twisted form of attachment. He became her entire world. And when your entire world is one person, you do what they say. You believe what they tell you. You stop asking questions because the answers are too terrifying to hear. And yet there were cracks, small ones, a word he let slip, a moment of distraction, a day when the food came a little earlier, or the light stayed on a little longer. Sarah began to notice patterns. She began to see that he was not as all-powerful as he seemed. He had routines, habits, weaknesses. He was tired sometimes. He was careless. And in those moments, she saw a flicker of something, a possibility, a hope, a question she had never dared to ask before. What if there was a way out? But that question was dangerous. It was a door she wasn't ready to open, because if she allowed herself to believe in escape, then every day she remained trapped would be a failure. Every day would be a betrayal of that hope. So she pushed the thought away. She buried it deep beneath the stories and the songs and the names of the cracks in the ceiling, and she waited. She waited as the seasons changed above her. Not that she could feel them, not really, but she could sense them in the dampness of the air, in the way the concrete grew colder or warmer against her bare feet. She waited as her body grew, as her bones lengthened and her voice dropped, as she became someone she didn't recognize. She waited for something, she didn't know what, a change, a sign, a crack in the walls that surrounded her. And the cracks, as it turned out, were already forming, not in the basement walls, but in the world above, in the house. In the minds of the people who walk past that basement door every single day without knowing what lay beneath their feet. But that's a story for another moment. For now, Sarah is still in the basement. The light bulb flickers, the walls breathe, and a girl who has never seen her own reflection waits, as she has always waited, for the world to change. And the world is about to, and so the world above began to shift. But it didn't happen all at once. It happened in whispers, in moments so small, so easy to miss, that you could almost believe they never happened at all. Let's step outside for a moment. Let's stand on that ordinary street, in that ordinary neighborhood, where the houses sit shoulder to shoulder and the lawns are kept neat. The kind of street where everyone knows everyone, or thinks they do. The kind of street where a missing child would be noticed, surely, where a cry for help would be heard, where the walls couldn't possibly hide a secret this dark. And yet, there was a neighbor, a woman 2 doors down, who remembered something strange. She'd been gardening one afternoon late spring, she thought, because the roses were just beginning to bloom, and she'd heard a sound. A thumping, a rhythmic, desperate thumping coming from beneath the ground. She'd paused, trowel in hand, and listened. It stopped, then started again, like someone was trying to break through the earth itself. She'd walked to the property line. She'd stood there, squinting at the Cody house. The windows were dark as always, the curtains drawn, the driveway empty, and the sound had stopped. She'd waited a full minute, maybe 2. Nothing, just the wind in the trees and the distant bark of a dog. And she'd told herself it was nothing, a pipe, a furnace kicking on, her imagination running wild in the afternoon heat. She'd gone back to her roses, and she'd never mentioned it to anyone, not once. But here's the thing about whispers, they don't go away. They accumulate. They stack up, one on top of another, like sediment at the bottom of a river, and eventually they form something solid, something that can't be ignored. There was a mail carrier too, a man who'd worked that route for 15 years. He remembered the Cody house because the mail never changed. Christmas cards, yes, always from the same return address, an elderly aunt in Ohio. Bills, always paid on time. And once a birthday card with a cartoon cat on the front, addressed to a name he didn't recognize. Sarah. He'd never seen a Sarah at that address. He'd never seen any children, come to think of it. He'd mentioned it to his supervisor once, in passing. Funny house on Maple, he'd said. Quiet, too quiet. And his supervisor had laughed and said, "Count your blessings, buddy. Quiet means no dogs chasing you down the street." The mail carrier had shrugged. He'd delivered the birthday card to the mailbox, and he'd moved on. He never thought about it again. But the card had been open. Somewhere in that house, a girl had held it in her hands. She'd traced the cartoon cat with her finger. She'd read the message inside, "Happy birthday, sweetie. Love, from Aunt Ruth." And she'd wondered what a birthday party looked like. She'd wondered if Aunt Ruth knew where she was. She'd wondered if anyone knew. And then her father had taken the card away. He'd torn it in half, right in front of her. He'd said, "You don't need that. You don't need anything from anyone." And Sarah had learned, yet again, that the world outside was a story told by other people, a story she could never touch. But the whispers kept coming. They came in the form of a teenage boy, 3 houses down, who'd been walking his dog late one night. He'd seen a light in the Cody basement window, a faint flickering glow, like a candle or a bare bulb. He'd stopped, curious, because he'd always thought that house was empty. The parents were never outside. No kids ever played in the yard. The whole place had a dead, hollow feel to it. But that night, the light was there, and he thought he saw a shadow pass in front of it. A small shadow, a child's shadow. He told his mother the next morning, "Mom, I think someone lives in the basement of that house on the corner." His mother had been making coffee. She barely looked up. "Don't be nosy, sweetheart. Some people keep their rec rooms down there." It didn't look like a rec room. "Well, it's none of our business. Stay away from that house." And he had. He'd stayed away. But he'd never forgotten that shadow. Years later, when the news broke, he would sit in his living room and weep. He would remember the light. He would remember the shape. He would remember that he'd seen something and that he'd let it go. Now imagine the weight of those moments. Imagine the accumulation. a neighbor's curiosity brushed aside, a mail carrier's observation laughed off, a teenager's sighting dismissed with a wave of the hand. Each one by itself was nothing, a blip, a coincidence. The brain's natural tendency to see patterns where none exist. But together, they formed a picture that no one was willing to look at. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about warning signs. They're only obvious in hindsight. In the moment, they're just noise. They're the furnace kicking on. They're the neighbor's kid playing too loud. They're a story you tell yourself to make the world feel safe again. And the world, for most people, had to feel safe. The alternative was unthinkable. The alternative meant that a child could be suffering right under their noses while they watered their lawns and watched their television shows and went about their ordinary, comfortable lives. So the whispers stayed whispers. They never became shouts. They never became a knock on the door, a call to the police, a question asked with the full weight of conviction. But Sarah felt them. In the basement, she felt the world shifting above her. She heard the footsteps that paused too long outside the house. She heard the muffled voices of neighbors talking to her father on the front step. She heard the silence that followed, heavy and full of questions, and she began to wonder, did they know? Could they sense her, somehow, through the concrete and the earth and the layers of denial? Could they feel her reaching up, like a root searching for sunlight? She started leaving signs, small things. At first, a piece of paper torn from a notebook with the word help written in shaky letters. She'd slide it under the basement door into the hallway beyond. She'd wait, heart pounding, for someone to find it, but her father always found it first. He'd pick it up, crumple it, and throw it in the trash. He'd say nothing. He'd just look at her with that flat, terrible expression, and she'd know that the sign had failed. She tried again. A sock, left in the hallway when the door was open. A cup, placed just so where someone might trip over it. A scratch on the floorboards, spelling out a single word, here. But the world above was too loud, too busy, too full of its own concerns. The signs went unseen, the whispers stayed unheard, and yet, there was one person who almost saw, a friend of the family, or what passed for a friend who came to the house one afternoon to drop off a casserole. Mrs. Delaney, her name was, a kind woman with a soft voice and a tendency to talk too much. She'd known the Codys for years, though she'd never quite understood them. They kept to themselves. They didn't invite anyone inside. They were polite but distant, like figures in a photograph. That day, Mrs. Delaney had knocked on the door. No answer. She'd tried the handle, and it was unlocked. She'd stepped inside just for a moment, just to set the casserole on the kitchen counter, and she'd heard something, a sound from below, a voice, thin and high, like a child singing. She'd frozen. She'd called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The singing stopped. The house went silent. Mrs. Delaney had stood there, casserole in hand, heart hammering. She'd thought about the basement door, just visible at the end of the hall. She thought about the sound, so faint, so fleeting, and then she told herself it was the radio, or the television, or the pipes. She'd set the casserole down, written a quick note, and left. She never came back, and Sarah, in the basement, had heard the footsteps retreat. She'd heard the front door close. She'd heard the car start, the engine fade into the distance. She'd pressed her hands against the wall, and she'd wept, because she'd been so close. So close to being seen, so close to being heard, and yet the world had turned away. The world had chosen not to see. But here's the thing about a secret that big, it can't stay hidden forever. The walls of that house were thin, the cracks were spreading, and the whispers, ignored and dismissed and buried, were beginning to gather force. They were becoming something else, something that would not be silenced. And Sarah in the dark could feel it. She could feel the change coming, like the pressure before a storm. She didn't know what it would look like. She didn't know when it would arrive. But she knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than hope, that the world was about to crack open, and when it did, she would be ready. And yet, that storm she felt coming, it wouldn't arrive the way she imagined. It never does it? The change she sensed, the pressure building in the air around that house on Hemlock Street, it wasn't going to come from the outside. Not yet. It was going to come from her. Now, here's the thing about living in a basement for years. You learn the house. You learn its rhythms, its moods, its secrets. You learn which floorboards creak at 2 in the morning, which pipes groan when the heat kicks on, which footsteps mean he's coming down the stairs with food, and which ones mean he's coming down with something else entirely. Sarah had learned all of that. She'd had to. It was survival. But in the weeks after the neighbor's visit, after that casserole had sat untouched on the counter, after the note had been read and crumpled, after the footsteps had walked away and the car had driven off and the hope had curdled into something bitter and cold, something shifted inside her. Not the hope. No, that had been starved nearly to death. It was something else, something harder. It was the realization that waiting was a kind of dying, and she was done dying. Now, you have to understand what that meant for a girl who had spent so many years in the dark. To decide consciously that you will no longer wait to be saved. That's a terrifying kind of liberation, because it means accepting that you might never be saved. It means accepting that the world might never come for you. And then in that awful, hollow acceptance, finding something else, finding the will to save yourself. Sarah didn't know how, not yet. She didn't have a plan, not really. But she had something she hadn't had in a very long time. She had intention. And intention, in a place like that, it's a dangerous thing. The days began to feel different. She started paying attention in a new way. She'd always listened for his footsteps, of course. That was automatic, instinctive, the way a rabbit listens for the shadow of a hawk. But now she was listening for something else. She was cataloging. She was mapping. She noticed, for instance, that he always came down the stairs at the same pace. Never fast, never slow. Measured, controlled. The way a man moves when he knows there's nowhere to run. She noticed that he always put the key in the lock with his right hand, that he always turned it twice, that he always pushed the door open with his shoulder because the frame had swollen in the humidity and it stuck just a little right there at the bottom. She noticed that he never checked the window. The one high up on the wall, the one she tried to reach 100 times, the one that was painted shut and covered in a film of grime so thick you could barely tell if it was day or night outside. He never checked it. He didn't think she could reach it, and honestly, he was right, she couldn't. But she could break it. Now, that thought came to her slowly, the way a shape emerges from fog. She didn't decide to break the window, she just started looking at it differently. Instead of seeing an impossible height, a painted frame, a hopeless distance from freedom, she started seeing glass. Glass that could shatter, glass that could cut, glass that could make a sound. And sound, she'd learned, was the only thing that could travel beyond those walls. She began to gather things, not all at once, she couldn't risk that. He'd notice if the room looked different, if anything was out of place. So she did it slowly. A scrap of metal she'd found wedged behind the old water heater, rusted and sharp along one edge. A length of wire that had come loose from the electrical box, carefully pulled free inch by inch over the course of a week. A piece of concrete that had crumbled from the foundation, small enough to fit in her palm, heavy enough to do damage. She hid them, under the mattress, behind the loose board in the corner, in the hollow space where the wall met the floor, where the drywall had rotted away and left a gap just big enough for her hand. And she waited. But here's the thing about waiting when you've decided to act. It changes the quality of the silence. It's no longer the silence of a trapped animal, hoping the predator won't notice it. It's the silence of a hunter, motionless, invisible, watching, waiting for the moment. And that moment came on a Tuesday. She knew it was Tuesday because he brought the newspaper down with him sometimes. Not to give to her, never that. He brought it for himself, to read while she ate, to remind her that the world outside was still turning, still full of people living ordinary lives, lives she would never have. He'd leave it on the floor when he went back upstairs, and she'd read it by the thin strip of light under the door. The date was always there, in the corner. Tuesday, February the 14th. Valentine's Day. She'd almost laughed when she saw it. Almost. But the laugh had caught in her throat, because there was nothing funny about it. Not really. Valentine's Day in the basement. The day of love, of hearts and flowers and couples holding hands. And she was down there, in the dark, with a man who had stolen her life. But that day something was different. He was different. He came down the stairs, and his footsteps were heavier. faster. She heard the key scrape against the lock, heard him curse under his breath when it didn't turn the first time. He was angry. She could feel it before she saw him, the way you can feel a storm coming in the pressure change. He opened the door, and he didn't say anything. He just stood there, breathing hard, his face shadowed in the dim light from the hallway. And Sarah knew. She'd seen this before. She'd felt it before. The way his moods would turn, the way something in the outside world, a bill he couldn't pay, a boss who'd yelled at him, a woman who'd rejected him, would curdle and fester until he needed someone to punish, and she was the only one available. He stepped forward. She stepped back. And then it happened. Now, I'm not going to describe what he did to her. Some things deserve to be left in the dark. But I will tell you this. When he was done, when he'd taken what he needed and left her crumpled on the concrete floor, when he'd locked the door and climbed the stairs and the house fell silent again, Sarah didn't cry. She lay there, bleeding, bruised, her body a map of old pain and new, and she didn't make a sound. Because she was thinking, she was remembering the scrap of metal behind the water heater, the wire, the concrete, the window, and she was thinking about the sound it would make when it shattered. She waited until she heard the television upstairs. He always watched television after. It was part of the pattern, the violence, then the television, then the sleep. He'd be on the couch in an hour, maybe two, and then he'd be dead to the world until morning. She gave it time. She counted her breaths. She let the pain settle into something she could carry, something she could use. And then she moved. She pulled herself up, ignoring the sharp protests from her ribs, her shoulder, her knee. She crossed to the corner where the water heater sat, rusted and humming. She reached behind it, her fingers finding the scrap of metal, cold and sharp. She pulled it out. Then she moved to the wall, the high window. She looked up at it, that rectangle of grimy glass, that impossible distance, and she felt the old despair rise up, the voice that said, you can't, you've tried before and you can't. She pushed it down. She picked up the piece of concrete, and she threw it. The sound was enormous. It wasn't the delicate crack she'd imagined. It was a shattering, an explosion, a roar of breaking glass that seemed to fill the entire house. She froze, her heart hammering, waiting for footsteps, waiting for the door to fly open, waiting for him to come back down. Nothing. The television kept playing. Some sitcom laugh track muffled through the floor he hadn't heard. Or he had heard and he'd dismissed it. The house settling. The pipes. Something. She didn't wait to find out which. She grabbed the scrap of metal and climbed onto the water heater, balancing on its curved top, reaching up toward the broken window. The frame was splintered, the glass jagged, the opening just wide enough. She could feel the cold air pouring in, real air, outside air, air that had never been breathed in this house. She grabbed the edge of the frame. The glass cut her hand. She didn't feel it. She pulled. And for the first time in years, Sarah Cody's head rose above ground level. The night air hit her face, the stars, the sound of a car passing somewhere in the distance, a dog barking, ordinary sounds, sounds she'd almost forgotten existed. She opened her mouth to scream. But before the sound could leave her throat, she saw the light come on in the living room. She saw his shadow pass across the curtain. She heard his footsteps, heavier now, moving toward the basement door. She had seconds. Maybe less. And she made a choice. She didn't scream. She dropped back down, landing hard on the concrete floor, the pain shooting through her ankle. She grabbed the piece of wire, the scrap of metal, the concrete. She grabbed everything she gathered, and she shoved them into the hollow space behind the loose board. She pulled the board back into place. She pressed herself into the corner, into the darkest part of the room, and she waited. The door flew open, the light came on. He stood there, his eyes scanning the room, his face twisted with suspicion. He looked at the window, at the broken glass, at the cold air pouring in, and then he looked at her. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to the window, pulled the curtain closed, and picked up the phone on the wall. He dialed. He said 3 words, "I need plywood." And then he looked at her again, and he smiled. It was the worst thing she'd ever seen, because that smile said, "I know what you tried to do. And it didn't work, and now there will be consequences." But here's what he didn't know. He didn't know about the scrap of metal behind the board. He didn't know about the wire, or the concrete, or the plan that was still forming in her mind. He didn't know that she had tasted the outside air, that she had seen the stars, that she had felt the wind on her face for the first time in years. He didn't know that the girl he'd locked in the basement wasn't the same girl who had climbed back down. He didn't know that she had changed, and he didn't know that she had seen something in that brief moment when her head was above ground. She'd seen the house next door. She'd seen the light on in the kitchen window. She'd seen the silhouette of a woman standing at the sink washing dishes. The same woman who had brought the casserole. The same woman who had heard the sound, so faint, so fleeting. And this time, Sarah had seen her face. This time she knew exactly who to call out to. The plywood went up the next morning. He nailed it over the window, layer after layer, until not a single crack of light could get through. The basement went dark. Colder, smaller. But Sarah didn't care, because she had a plan now. A real plan. And it started with the scrap of metal and the wire and the concrete. It started with the knowledge that the window was gone, but the wall was thin. It started with the woman next door, and the light in her kitchen, and the sound she had almost heard. And it started with a single, impossible hope that this time, when Sarah screamed, someone would be listening. The silence that followed the plywood going up was a different kind of silence. Not the quiet of submission, not the hollow emptiness of a girl who had given up. No, this was the silence of a predator, crouched in the dark, waiting. Sarah didn't scream that night. She didn't pound on the walls. She sat in the corner in the absolute black and she listened. She listened to his footsteps above her pacing. She listened to the creak of the stairs, the way he stopped halfway down, as if testing her. She didn't move. She barely breathed. And after a long, long moment, he went back up. Now, here's the thing about a predator. They rely on patterns. They rely on predictability. They rely on the victim doing what they've always done. So when Sarah stopped screaming, it confused him. It unsettled him. And in that tiny crack of confusion, she found her advantage. She spent the next 3 days building. Not a weapon, not exactly, but a tool. She took that scrap of metal she'd been saving, the one with the jagged edge, and she began to work on the concrete wall, not the wall that faced the window. That was too thick, too reinforced. No, she worked on the wall that faced the neighbor's house, the wall that was just old plaster and lath crumbling with age. She worked in the dark by touch alone, scraping, gouging, carving. She worked until her fingers bled, until her nails were torn down to the quick. And when she was too exhausted to continue, she slept in the dirt, curled around her secret. And here's the thing about that woman next door, the woman who had brought the casserole. Her name was Diane. Diane had lived in that house for 30 years. She knew the sound of a raccoon in the trash, the sound of a branch scraping a window. But that sound, the one she'd heard that night, the one that had made her pause at the sink, dish in hand, water running, that sound had lodged itself somewhere deep. She couldn't shake it. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the new neighbor was just a private man, that his daughter was sick, that the noises were just the house settling. But the next morning, when she saw him nailing plywood over the basement window, she felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Now, Diane wasn't the type to meddle. She kept to herself. She minded her own business. But that knot wouldn't go away. It stayed with her while she drank her coffee. It stayed with her while she watched the neighbor's house, saw the curtains drawn tight, saw the man leave for work at the same time every morning, saw him return at the same time every evening. And it stayed with her when she noticed something strange. The man never brought out any trash, no grocery bags, no takeout containers, nothing. And he never ever had visitors, not once. And so on the 4th day after the plywood went up, Diane did something she hadn't planned on doing. She called the non-emergency line for the local police. She told them she was concerned about a neighbor. She told them about the sound, the casserole, the boarded up window. She told them it was probably nothing. But the dispatcher, a woman with a calm, patient voice, said something that made Diane's blood run cold. She said, "Mom, you're the 3rd person to call about that address this month. 3 calls. 3 different people. Each one had heard something, seen something, felt something wrong. But none of them had known what to do, and none of them had connected the dots. Until now. The police arrived on a Tuesday morning. A patrol car, 2 officers. They knocked on the front door. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. They walked around the side of the house, and there it was, the basement window covered in fresh plywood, nailed from the outside. The officer leaned close, pressed his ear to the wood, and for a long moment he heard nothing. He was about to turn away to write it off as a paranoid neighbor when he heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile it could have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind, it was a voice. A voice. A voice that had been buried for so long it had almost forgotten how to be heard. He called for backup. Now what happened next happened fast. The officers forced the door. They cleared the house room by room, empty. The man was at work, and then they found the basement door. It was locked, bolted from the outside. They had to use a battering ram. And when the door finally gave way, when the light from the hallway spilled down those concrete steps, they saw her. A woman, curled in the corner, her hands over her head, as if bracing for a blow. She was emaciated, her hair was matted, her skin was the color of ash, and she was shaking violently, uncontrollably. One of the officers, a woman named Martinez, knelt down. She didn't reach out. She didn't touch her. She just said softly, "It's okay. We're here. You're safe now." And Sarah didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked up, and for the first time in years, she saw the sky. Through the open door, a sliver of blue. She stared at it, unblinking, as if she had forgotten what color looked like. And then she whispered, so quietly the officer had to lean in to hear, "Is it real?" The rescue itself was only the beginning. The aftermath was something else entirely. Sarah was taken to a hospital, wrapped in a blanket, placed in the back of an ambulance. She didn't speak during the ride. She just stared out the window, watching the world rush by. Trees, houses, cars, people. Everything she had only imagined, only remembered from a life that had ended when she was 12. Now she was 26. 14 years. 14 years in a basement. And the world had changed. She had changed. And nothing at all was familiar. The doctor said she was physically stable, but that word stable, it meant nothing. Her body had survived, but her mind was still in that basement. She flinched at every sound. She couldn't sleep in a bed. She slept on the floor, curled in a corner with a blanket over her head. She couldn't eat with utensils. She used her hands, tearing at the food as if she expected it to be taken away. She couldn't look anyone in the eye. She couldn't speak above a whisper. And when she did speak, it was in fragments, in pieces, in the same way a child learns to talk. But here's the thing about the human spirit. It's stubborn. It's resilient. It doesn't know how to give up even when it wants to. And Sarah, deep down, in that place where hope had been buried alive, she wanted to live. She didn't know how, but she wanted to, and that honestly was enough. The police arrested the man that evening. He came home from work, found the lights on, the door open. He knew. He tried to run, but they were waiting, and when they put him in the back of the squad car, he didn't say a word. He just stared straight ahead, the same blank expression he'd worn for 14 years. The same expression he'd worn while he fed her scraps. The same expression he'd worn while he nailed the window shut. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man, and that somehow was worse. The news spread fast, local, then national. Reporters camped outside the hospital. They wanted her story. They wanted her face. But Sarah's doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Chen, made a decision. She told the media, "This woman has been invisible for 14 years. She will not be a spectacle." And she meant it. She closed the blinds. She locked the doors. And she sat with Sarah hour after hour, night after night, waiting for her to speak. And when Sarah finally did speak, it wasn't about the abuse. It wasn't about the darkness. It was about the light. She said, "I used to dream about the color blue. I didn't remember what it looked like. I just knew it was there, and I held on to it. I held on to it like a rope." Dr. Chen didn't interrupt. She just listened. And Sarah kept talking for hours until her voice gave out. And when she stopped, she was crying, not sobbing, just tears running down her face, silent and steady. And she said, "I thought I'd forgotten how." The recovery was slow, painfully slow, painfully slow. There were days when Sarah couldn't get out of bed. Days when she screamed at the nurses, begged them to lock the door, to leave her alone. Days when she tried to claw at the walls to find the basement again, because the basement was familiar and the world above was terrifying. But there were also small victories. The first time she ate a meal without hiding the food. The first time she walked outside barefoot on the grass. The first time she laughed, a short, startled sound, like she had surprised herself. And there was the day she asked to see the sky. Not from a window, not from a doorway, but from outside, lying on the ground, looking up. Dr. Chen took her to a quiet field behind the hospital. Sarah lay down, spread her arms, and stared up at the vast, endless blue. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just lay there, breathing for a long, long time. And then she said, "It's even better than I imagined." The investigation took months. The trial would take longer. But Sarah didn't think about that. She thought about the sky. She thought about the grass. She thought about the woman next door, Diane, who had made a phone call that changed everything. She wanted to thank her, but she wasn't ready yet. She wasn't ready to face the world, to face the questions, to face the memory of that basement. But she would be, someday. Because the girl who had climbed back down into the darkness was not the same girl who had come up. That girl had learned something. She had learned that even in the deepest dark there is a crack, and through that crack, light gets in. Eventually, and for Sarah, the light was just beginning. Now, the machinery of justice began to turn, and it was grinding, slow and merciless in its own way. You see, there's a peculiar thing about a case like Sarah's. The law is built for events that happen in a single moment. A robbery, an assault, a murder. But how do you prosecute a crime that lasted for years? How do you fit a decade of suffering into a legal framework designed for single incidents? Here's the thing. The prosecutors had to become archaeologists. They had to dig through layers of time, of memory, of evidence that had literally decayed. The basement had been cleaned hastily, desperately, after Diane's phone call, but not well enough. Forensic teams found hair, fibers, DNA from years of confinement. They found the lock on the inside of the door, the one that could only be turned from the outside. They found the mattress, stained and sagging, still holding the impression of a body that had lain there night after night. And yet the greatest challenge wasn't physical evidence. It was Sarah herself. Because to testify, she would have to go back down. Not literally, no, but in her mind. She would have to describe the darkness, the cold, the sound of the lock clicking shut. She would have to describe the faces of the people who had kept her there. Her parents, the people who were supposed to protect her. The defense attorneys, of course, saw an opportunity. They argued that Sarah was unstable, that her memories were unreliable, that she had been influenced by therapists, that perhaps she had chosen to stay. You can imagine the strategy, can't you? Blame the victim, question her credibility, make the jury wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was exaggerating. After all, who would keep their own child in a basement for years? It was so unthinkable that they hoped the jury would think it was unbelievable. But here's where the case took a turn. The prosecution brought in expert psychologists who specialized in long-term captivity, in trauma bonding, in the ways the human mind adapts to survive the unthinkable. And one of them, a woman named Dr. Alina Vasquez, said something that silenced the courtroom. She said, "Sarah didn't survive despite her coping mechanisms. She survived because of them. The silence, the compliance, the dissociation. Those weren't weaknesses. They were strategies. They were how she stayed alive." The jury leaned forward. The judge leaned forward. Even the defense attorney stopped shuffling papers. And then Sarah took the stand. Now, imagine this scene. A young woman, not quite 30, walks into a courtroom filled with strangers, with cameras, with the people who imprisoned her. She sits down. She looks at the judge. She looks at the jury. And she begins to speak. Her voice, at first, is barely a whisper. She describes the first night in the basement, the cold concrete floor, the sound of the door closing, the silence that followed. She describes the years, the birthdays, the Christmases, the ordinary days that blurred into one long gray twilight. And here's the moment that broke the courtroom open. The prosecutor asked her, "Sarah, did you ever think about escaping?" She paused, a long pause, the kind of pause that feels like a held breath, and she said, "Every day. For the first few years, I tried the door, I tried the windows, I tried to dig through the wall with a spoon once, but then I stopped, because hope was too painful. It was easier to stop hoping. It was easier to just exist." The jury foreman later said that when she said that word, exist, he saw several jurors wipe their eyes, because it wasn't a story about a monster. It was a story about a person who had been reduced to the barest flicker of life. And they understood in that moment that survival isn't heroic, it's desperate, it's ugly, it's just holding on. The trial lasted 6 weeks, 6 weeks of testimony, of evidence, of arguments. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated cruelty, of a couple who had isolated their daughter, who had hidden her from the world, who had chosen day after day not to let her go. The defense painted a picture of a troubled family, of a daughter who had mental health issues, of a situation that had spiraled out of control. But here's the thing about abasement. It's not a spiral. It's a choice. Every day that the door stayed locked was a choice. Every meal brought down, every silence maintained, every scream ignored. Those were choices. And the jury saw that. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Sarah wasn't in the courtroom. She was at the hospital, in a quiet room with Dr. Chen, waiting. The call came through on a speakerphone, the foreman's voice, reading the words, "Guilty on all counts. Both parents, multiple charges, kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault," the list went on. And Sarah didn't cry. She didn't care. She just sat there, very still, and then she said, "Okay, just that, okay." Because what was there to say? Justice had been done, but justice doesn't give you back the years. It doesn't give you back the birthdays, the friends, the first kiss, the prom, the college application, the ordinary, beautiful, boring life that everyone else takes for granted. But here's the complicated part. The part that doesn't fit neatly into a news story. The sentencing. The judge, a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, interestingly enough, had to decide how long they would serve. And the prosecution asked for life. The defense asked for leniency, and the judge in her chambers read letters from neighbors who said they never knew, letters from family members who said they suspected but didn't want to interfere, letters from Sarah herself. And Sarah's letter, well, it was brief. She wrote, "I don't know what punishment fits. I don't know if any punishment can fit, but I know that I am free now. And they are not. That is enough. That has to be enough." The judge sentenced them to 25 years to life. The father didn't react. The mother began to cry loud, theatrical sobs that echoed through the courtroom. And Sarah, watching from a video feed in a separate room, felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pity. Not forgiveness, not yet, but pity, because she looked at her mother, sobbing, and she thought she will never understand what she did. She will never truly know. And that, in a way, is its own punishment. Now the trial was over, but the questions lingered. Because a case like Sarah's doesn't just end with a verdict. It echoes. It raises uncomfortable truths about the world we live in. How many other basements are there? How many other locked doors? How many children, spouses, elders, hidden away, silenced, erased from the world? Here's a number that might haunt you. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, there are thousands of cases of forced labor, forced marriage, and domestic servitude reported every year in the United States alone. And those are just the reported cases. The real number is likely much higher. Sarah's story is not an anomaly. It is a window into a hidden world, a world of people who exist in plain sight but are never seen. And yet Sarah's case did something remarkable. It sparked a conversation. Legislators began to look at laws around long-term confinement. Social services started training to recognize signs of hidden abuse. Neighbors began to wonder, to ask questions, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Diane, the woman next door, became a symbol of what one person can do when they pay attention. But for Sarah, the trial was a door closing. A heavy iron door slamming shut on a chapter of her life. And now she stood on the other side in a world she barely recognized, a world of smartphones and social media, of streaming services and self-driving cars, of a culture that had moved on without her. She had to learn how to be a person in the 21st century. She had to learn how to trust, how to hope, how to dream again. And that would be the hardest part of all, because the basement had taught her many things. It had taught her patience. It had taught her endurance. It had taught her to find light in the smallest cracks. But it had not taught her how to live. Not really. It had taught her how to survive. And survival and living, you see, are not the same thing. So she began slowly, tentatively, with the help of Dr. Chen, with the support of a small group of people who had become her new family. She started with small things, ordering coffee, walking through a grocery store, choosing what to wear. Each decision felt enormous, terrifying, exhilarating. She was like a child learning to walk, except she was a woman learning to exist. And there were setbacks. Of course there were. Nights when the fear came back, when the walls felt too close, when she had to sit in the middle of an open field just to breathe. Days when she couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of lost years pressed down on her chest. Moments when she wondered if she would ever feel normal, whatever that meant. But here's the thing about Sarah. She had spent years in the dark. She knew, better than anyone, that light doesn't come all at once. It comes in fragments, in moments, in the kindness of a stranger, the warmth of the sun, the sound of rain on the roof, and she was learning to collect those fragments, to hold them close, to build a life out of them. And the next chapter of her story, well, it would be about that, about rebuilding, about the long, slow, beautiful process of becoming a person again, about life above ground, where the air is fresh and the sky is wide and the future is not a locked door but an open horizon. Because Sarah had climbed out of the basement, and now she had to learn how to stand in the sun. And so we find Sarah Cody in a world she was never supposed to see. Not the basement, not the four walls that had defined her for so long, but here in the light, in the open, in a life that feels honestly almost too big to hold. You see, when you've spent years in a space that measures maybe 10 feet by 12, the sky doesn't just look wide, it looks impossible. It looks like a lie. Sarah would tell you later that the first time she stood outside without someone watching, without a chain around her ankle, she felt dizzy, not from the heat or the cold, but from the sheer emptiness above her, the endless blue, the clouds drifting like they had nowhere to be. And she thought, how is this real? How is this mine? But here's the thing about freedom. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces, in fragments. And for Sarah, the first real piece was a name. Not the name her captors had given her. Not the label, the number, the thing she'd been reduced to, but her own name. Sarah. Spoken by a therapist who looked her in the eye and said, Sarah, you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become now. And oh, those words. They sat inside her like a seed, a small, fragile thing, and she watered it day by day with the hardest work she had ever done. Now, rebuilding a life, really rebuilding it, is not like putting together a puzzle where all the pieces are in the box. It's more like learning to walk after your legs have been broken, and then reset, and then broken again. Sarah had to relearn everything: how to sleep without flinching at every sound, how to eat without rationing, without hiding food in her pockets, how to trust that the door would stay open, that the sun would rise, that the people around her were not a threat, and yet she did it, slowly, painfully, with setbacks that would have crushed a lesser spirit. There were nights, many nights, when she woke up screaming, when she reached for a wall that wasn't there, when the darkness of the basement swallowed her even in a room full of light. And on those nights, she would sit on the floor of her small apartment, her back against the radiator, and she would breathe in, out, and she would remind herself, I am not there. I am here. I am safe. But safety was a strange thing. It didn't feel like a locked door. It felt like a choice to believe that the world could be kind, that people could be good, that she could be whole. Now, the court case, that was its own kind of ordeal. Sarah had to sit in a room with the man who had taken everything from her. She had to look at him, to speak his name, to tell the world what he had done. And she did it, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to. Because somewhere inside her a fire had been lit. A fire that said, I will not be silent, I will not be erased, I will not let him win. And the verdict, well, it came down like thunder. Guilty on every count. The sentence, decades, enough that he would die in prison, felt like a door slamming shut, a door that would never open again. And Sarah sat in the gallery, her hands trembling, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt free. But here's the thing about justice. It's not the end of the story. It's just a chapter, because after the trial, after the cameras left, after the world moved on to the next tragedy, Sarah was still here, still breathing, still trying to figure out how to be a person in a world that didn't have a manual for what she'd been through. She got a job, a small one, at a bookstore. And, that might sound ordinary, but for Sarah, it was monumental. She learned to talk to customers, to smile, to answer questions about books she'd never read. And slowly the walls she'd built around her heart began to crack. Just a little, just enough. She made friends. Real ones. People who didn't know her story or who knew it and didn't flinch. People who invited her to dinner, to movies, to walks in the park. And every time she said yes, it was like planting another seed, another root reaching down into the soil of a life she was building. And then there was trust, that big, terrifying, beautiful thing. Sarah met someone. A man named David, who worked at the coffee shop next to the bookstore. He was gentle, patient. He didn't push. He didn't ask. And when she finally told him, when she sat across from him at a small table and let the words spill out like water from a broken dam, he didn't run. He didn't look at her like she was broken. He just reached across the table and took her hand. And he said, I'm sorry that happened to you. And I'm glad you're here now. And Sarah, she cried, not from sadness, from relief, from the sheer, overwhelming weight of being seen, of being known, of being loved not despite her scars, but because of them. Now, you might think that's the end of the story. The happy ending, the girl who escaped the basement and found love and lived happily ever after. But that's not how real life works, is it? Real life is messier, real life is harder, and real life, it goes on. Sarah still has bad days. Days when the past feels closer than the present. Days when she has to remind herself that she is safe, that she is strong, that she is more than what was done to her. But those days are fewer now. And on the good days, the days when the sun is warm and the sky is blue and she can hear the birds singing, she walks through the city and she feels alive. Truly, fully, impossibly alive. And she thinks about the girl in the basement. The girl who thought she would never see the light. The girl who whispered to herself in the dark. Who counted the days. Who dreamed of a world she couldn't touch. And she wants to go back to that girl, to reach through time and space and take her hand and say, you will survive, you will escape, you will live. And one day you will stand in the sun and you will feel it on your skin and you will know with absolute certainty that you are free. So here's where we leave Sarah. Not at the end of her story, but at the beginning of something new. A life above ground, a life in the light. A life that she built, brick by brick, moment by moment, with courage and grace and an unbreakable will. And if her story teaches us anything, it's that the human spirit is stronger than any chain, that hope can survive the deepest dark, and that no matter how long you've been buried, there is always a way back to the surface. Thank you for listening to Sarah's story. If it moved you, if it gave you hope, if it reminded you of the strength we all carry inside, then please share it. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, of survival, of the light that finds us even in our darkest moments, subscribe to Eridanus Light, because there are always more stories to tell. And every one of them matters. This is Eridanus Light, and we'll see you in the next story.